Today, we take a look at YouTubers who died on camera for fame. From a woman who went live and started tasting an exotic frog in a rainforest, to a man who set up his camera and jumped on a wide, exposed snow slope, not knowing it would end in the most devastating way possible. It was June 14, 2017, and the lowland rainforest outside a small rural community in Costa Rica was already thick with morning humidity as the group pushed past the tree line. The canopy filtered the light into pale, broken shafts that barely reached the forest floor. The air smelled of wet soil and decomposing leaves. Insects moved in steady, overlapping waves of sound. The trail was narrow and unmarked, more a worn gap between roots and undergrowth than anything maintained. Visibility beyond 20 feet was limited by dense vegetation, and small streams cut across the uneven ground. Haley Vant was 26. Before making videos, she worked retail, long shifts, low pay, and a ceiling she could clearly see. She was sharp, socially confident, and knew how to hold attention. She learned early that people responded to risk. Not polished risk, but the raw kind that felt real. Her channel grew on that instinct. Each video pushed further. She ate things she shouldn't and handled things she wasn't trained to handle. Her audience rewarded her every time. In the weeks before the trip, her views plateaued, and she promoted this stunt as a no safety, no research jungle consumption challenge, promising a live, unedited escalation. Traveling with her that morning was a local guide in his 40s and a freelance cameraman in his early 20s. The guide made his position clear before they entered the forest. He knew the terrain and what lived in it, and he had concerns about what Haley intended to do. She had told her audience she would consume whatever she found in the jungle. She repeated this on camera, calling it the video that would put her back on top. His warnings were recorded but not taken seriously. He later said he had never been more certain something would go wrong. The group followed a stream deeper into the forest. Haley used a small plastic container and her bare hands to collect insects and tiny amphibians, explaining she needed multiple rounds for escalation. The cameraman stayed close, shooting handheld. Near the stream bank, she spotted a small frog resting on a broad leaf. It was 1 to 2 inches long and brightly colored. A natural warning. The guide recognized it immediately and told her not to touch it. The exchange was captured on camera. She picked it up anyway. She held it longer than anything else, turning it toward the lens. Her expression shifted, calculation more than hesitation. She asked if the camera was rolling. The guide told her again to stop. She exhaled, brought it closer, paused just short of contact, then followed through. What happened next unfolded over several minutes, and the camera recorded most of it. She bit down on the frog, breaking the skin. The species was later assessed as a Central American poison frog, carrying alkaloid toxins such as pumiliotoxins, not true batrachotoxin. The toxin contacted her lips, tongue, and oral tissue. Small cuts on her lips from earlier created additional entry points. The compound moved through the mucous membranes and into her bloodstream. Her speech began to lose rhythm within minutes. Words came out slightly off, then slurred. She steadied herself against a nearby trunk. Her hands trembled. Muscle twitching appeared around her jaw and forearms. She dropped to one knee, then both. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. She tried to stand once. She couldn't. She collapsed onto her side on the forest floor. Purposeful movement stopped shortly after. Her breathing continued briefly, then ceased. The guide tried to keep her airway open and called for evacuation, but there was no advanced medical support nearby, and the terrain made rapid response impossible. By the time help could have reached them, there was nothing left to intervene. The camera eventually dropped toward the ground. The stream ended there. An official review determined the cause of death as acute toxic exposure leading to respiratory failure, consistent with amphibian alkaloid poisoning absorbed through oral tissue. The mechanism involved disruption of nerve signaling to the muscles responsible for breathing. There was no external trauma. The recovered footage was turned over to local authorities. The guide's warnings were clearly audible and noted in the report. The frog was identified by a wildlife specialist. The report clarified the effects aligned with regional toxins rather than classic batrachotoxin, which is mainly associated with South American species. It was September 3, 2016, and the fairground lot on the outskirts of a small Ohio town was quiet in the way that empty event spaces tend to be: wide, flat, and carrying the leftover smell of diesel and trampled grass from the weekend crowd that had already cleared out. The sky was overcast but dry. There was no wind. The lot itself was packed gravel and dirt, bordered by temporary fencing and a row of idle equipment trailers. It was the kind of place that felt purposeful only when it was full of people. That afternoon, afternoon, it held a small crew and a camera. Lyra Scoff was 24. She had spent most of her working life in event setup, hauling equipment, building temporary structures, learning how things were assembled and taken apart. That background gave her a practical confidence around rigging and staging that most people her age didn't have. She was organized, detail-oriented, and enthusiastic about the content she made. Her channel was built around precision stunts, setups that looked dangerous but were, in her framing, carefully controlled. The gap between what looked risky and what actually was risky was something she believed she understood better than her audience gave her credit for. Her boyfriend was 27. He worked in a general trade and had been performing knife throws in their videos for several months. He had no formal training, no instruction, no supervised practice under anyone with credentials. What he had was repetition. Both had come to treat consistency as a substitute for expertise. He wasn't just participating, he was a central part of the channel's identity, tied to the throws, and stopping meant losing momentum. Also present was a 19-year-old assistant whose role that afternoon was to operate the wooden wheel, a roughly 5-foot diameter rotating board that Lyra would be strapped to during the throw sequence. The wheel was mounted on a simple axle frame, with rotation controlled from behind, using a hand crank to keep the motion steady. 2 cameras were set up, one directly in front and one off to the side, both angled to capture the full frame of the stunt. Lyra was secured at the wrists and ankles to the board. The wheel rotated at a steady, manually controlled pace. Earlier in that same session, several throws had landed cleanly. The footage from those attempts showed consistent rotation and no visible issues with grip or release. The audience watching the live stream had been growing with each successful throw, and the energy in the comments reflected it. Viewer count ticks were climbing in real time, and they pushed to extend the run and top the previous sequence while the audience was still rising. The assistant later told investigators that nothing about the setup felt different going into the throw that followed. What changed was small, and it happened fast. Investigators reviewing the footage noted that the blade left his hand at a slightly different angle than previous attempts, consistent with a grip that gave way a fraction of a second too early. The knife did not travel in a clean rotation. It tumbled unevenly through roughly 15 feet of open air between them. It struck Lyra on the left side of her chest, between the ribs, just below the collarbone. The blade entered the chest cavity. Findings were consistent with injury to the lung and damage to adjacent major vessels. The wheel continued turning through part of another rotation before slowing unevenly as the assistant lost control of the crank. Lyra's body slumped forward against the restraints. Blood spread across the front of her shirt rapidly. Her breathing, visible on the side camera footage, became fast and shallow, then progressively weaker. Her head dropped forward. There was no coordinated movement after that point. Emergency services were contacted while the camera was still recording. The crew did not remove the blade. Pressure was applied around the wound while they waited. The nearest capable facility was not close, and the response time was not fast enough to change the outcome. Both cameras were recovered and reviewed in full. The footage allowed investigators to reconstruct the throw mechanics with reasonable precision. The knife showed no defect. The failure was in execution, not equipment. The boyfriend was interviewed at length. No criminal charges were filed, though the local prosecutor's office reviewed the case. The cause of death was later confirmed by the medical examiner as penetrating chest trauma resulting in hemopneumothorax, collapsing the lung and leading to fatal circulatory failure. Given the location and severity, there was no realistic intervention at the scene that could have reversed it. The wheel, straps, and both cameras were held as evidence. It was April 22, 2018, and the private wildlife park sat on a wide stretch of flat land in central Texas, where the sky runs unbroken from one tree line to the next. The afternoon was dry and warm. There was little shade inside the enclosures, and the ground was packed hard from years of foot traffic and animal movement. The park was small, run by a handful of staff, not a corporate outfit, housing a rotating collection of exotic animals, some rescues, some privately acquired. It was not open to the public that day. Braden Glass had arranged access specifically to film, framing the visit as a no barrier, no cut shoot meant to push beyond his usual controlled encounters and capture something that felt unscripted and extreme. He was 28, and he had built his channel on a simple formula: get close to things most people wouldn't. He had started out doing delivery work, spending long hours on the road before turning to content creation. He was physically confident, tolerant of discomfort, and came across as genuinely unbothered on camera. But his growth had recently slowed, and his videos leaned harder into escalation, each one needing to go further to keep attention and maintain relevance. That quality had served him well. It also made him difficult to caution. The park's handler was in his 50s, experienced, and had worked with large birds long enough to read their behavior. He remained near the enclosure gate rather than inside it. A camerawoman in her mid-20s handled the stabilized footage, keeping her distance to frame the full scene. The enclosure was roughly 40 feet across with a packed dirt floor. Inside stood an adult ostrich close to 8 feet tall. Ostriches are not aggressive by default, but they are territorial and highly sensitive to perceived threats. The handler knew this and communicated it clearly before Braden entered. He warned specifically against approaching from behind or attempting dominance behaviors, stressing that the bird would interpret it as a direct and immediate threat. The bird paced along the far side, maintaining distance while keeping its eye fixed on him. That level of focus was assessment, not curiosity. Braden moved toward the bird anyway. He slowed as he closed the distance, briefly glancing back at the camera as if confirming the shot was still centered. There was a short pause, just a second or two, where he stood within reach, visibly gauging the bird's stance and balance before committing. He approached from behind and to the side, reaching for the feathers near the base of the neck. The move mirrored prior stunts where he tried to mount large animals for a striking visual suited to thumbnails and short-form clips. His intent was to mount the animal. The ostrich reacted the moment contact was made, bolting forward with enough force to break away. Braden lost his footing and went down hard. The bird turned immediately. That pivot was fast and consistent with a threat response. It did not retreat. It moved toward him. The first kick struck his torso as he tried to push himself up. Ostriches kick forward, driving force through a reinforced toe that functions like a blunt instrument. The impact knocked him onto his back. The second kick followed almost immediately, directed downward into his chest and upper abdomen. After that, there was no visible attempt to move. The camerawoman, by her account, stopped moving when the second strike landed. The handler entered and pushed the bird back using a long-handled pole with a V-shaped end kept near the gate. By the time he reached Braden, there was no meaningful response. The camerawoman remained outside and kept recording. Emergency services were contacted from the park's office. The location delayed response time, and the injuries were beyond what limited care could manage. He was transported but did not survive. The investigation relied on the footage and the handler's account. The warnings given before entry matched what was seen. Investigators noted the actions appeared deliberate and performance-driven, consistent with a pattern of escalating risk in his previous content. The animal behaved within expected stress responses. No fault was assigned to staff or containment. The cause of death was confirmed as blunt force trauma to the chest and upper abdomen, leading to severe internal bleeding and catastrophic organ damage that was not survivable. The pattern of injuries was consistent with the force of an ostrich kick. All footage, witness statements, and animal records were preserved as part of the official case file. It was June 14, 2016, and the limestone cave system beneath a private stretch of land in the Kentucky Karst region sat well outside any managed or publicly accessible area. The entrance was narrow, a low opening in a hillside, partially obscured by vegetation, with no signage or formal trail. Inside, passages branched in multiple directions, some wide enough to walk upright, others dropping into tight horizontal crawls. The rock was pale, layered limestone formed in thin sedimentary sheets. In places, those layers were fractured, with thin ceiling plates separated along natural bedding planes, some partially detached and held only by friction. The air was cool and damp. Natural light faded within 20 feet, leaving the interior dependent on artificial light. Kimberly Nash was 27. She had built her channel around escalating physical challenges, content that pushed steadily toward situations most people would avoid. She was energetic, quick on camera, and understood what her audience responded to. Recently, she began repositioning her channel, testing a shift toward exploration-based content designed to reach a broader audience while maintaining intensity. This cave shoot was framed as a pilot for that rebrand, blending controlled risk with a more immersive, extreme exploration angle. She acknowledged that change on camera before this shoot, explaining she was experimenting with a new direction and gauging how far she could push it. The cave was promoted as the tightest crawl she had attempted, serving as a proof of of concept focused on confinement and realism rather than spectacle alone. With her were two people, a videographer positioned to maintain continuous footage throughout the crawl and a local caver brought in to identify a suitable passage. Kimberly chose the narrowest crawl available to preserve the intensity her audience expected within the rebrand. Not the safest, but the most visually compelling. She entered head first, keeping her face toward the camera while eliminating any easy retreat. She began a live stream before entering. The crawl measured roughly 10 to 12 inches at its tightest point. She moved forward on her stomach, pulling with her elbows as the head-mounted camera transmitted continuously. About 20 feet in, she paused to adjust the camera, pressing her shoulder upward into the ceiling. The ceiling there was a thin limestone bedding plane already separated along natural fractures. Her movement didn't create the break. It shifted a plate that had already been unstable. Small fragments fell onto her back and helmet. She noted them and continued, briefly acknowledging on stream that this unpredictability fit the new format. Seconds later, a larger section detached. Investigators estimated it at 15 to 20 pounds, but in the confined space the effect was amplified. Her body had nowhere to shift, and the impact drove her torso into the cave floor, compressing her chest. She tried to push upward. The movement transferred force into the exposed fractured layer above. The initial collapse had removed support, triggering a secondary cascade. Additional debris fell around her shoulders and neck, narrowing the passage and locking her in place. The videographer attempted to pull her back. The geometry prevented leverage, and each attempt caused her torso to bind tighter against the rock. Instead of freeing her, the pulling force turned her body into a wedge, increasing pressure on her chest. Her breathing, audible on the live stream, became progressively shallower. Each inhale shortened. The intervals between breaths lengthened as compression restricted expansion. Her movements slowed, then stopped. The stream remained active for several minutes, capturing weakened breathing before it faded into silence. The local caver exited and called for help. Rescuers determined that removing debris without stabilization would likely trigger a larger collapse. The ceiling remained unstable, and aggressive extraction risked further failure. Space, angle, and rock conditions limited intervention, forcing a cautious approach. Kimberly Nash remained in place until she was no longer alive. Recovery was completed after stabilizing the passage. The head-mounted camera was recovered, still attached to her helmet. The live stream, videographer's footage, and witness account were reviewed during the investigation. The cause of death was confirmed as compressive asphyxia due to sustained chest restriction, with contributing blunt force impact to the upper back. The cave section was later flagged as unstable by local caving groups. Recovered footage and equipment were retained as part of the formal case record. It was January 27, 2018, and the backcountry slope in the Colorado High Country had been building toward something for days. A series of storms had moved through the range in the preceding week, dropping fresh snow over a base that had already gone through several freeze-thaw cycles. The result was a layered snowpack, new accumulation sitting over a compressed, slick foundation that had not bonded properly. The slope faced outward at roughly 30 degrees, which sits squarely in the range where slab avalanches are most likely to release. The sky that morning was flat and gray. There was no wind at the time of the incident. The snow surface was unbroken and unmarked in every direction. Cole Drin was 29. Before he started making content, he had spent several years working in a warehouse, physical, repetitive work that paid steadily but offered nothing he found meaningful. The channel had changed that. He built it around outdoor environments, specifically the kind that pushed against comfort, snow, altitude, exposure. He was drawn to landscapes that looked hostile and liked presenting himself as someone who moved through them without difficulty. In recent uploads, he had begun pushing into more exposed terrain, each location chosen to raise the level of risk he showed on camera. He was fit, self-reliant, and genuinely at ease in cold environments. What he lacked was formal training in the specific hazards those environments carried. He had never taken an avalanche safety course. He did not carry a beacon, a probe, or a shovel. None of that equipment appears in any of his videos. He had hiked to the location alone. A tripod-mounted camera had been set up approximately 20 feet downhill from where he intended to film, angled upslope to capture him against the open snowfield. a wider, more exposed slope than he had featured in his previous videos. The setup was deliberate. He had positioned himself so the camera would show the full expanse of the slope behind him. What it also captured, though he gave no indication of noticing, was a faint cracking pattern already present near the ridgeline above his position. The footage from that camera is the only record of what happened. He began jumping and stomping along the surface of the snow, moving laterally across the slope to test and demonstrate stability on camera. On the recording, the snow surface shows no immediate response to the first several impacts. Then, without transitional warning, a fracture line opened across the slope above him. It shot laterally in both directions within a fraction of a second, the way slab fractures do when the weak layer beneath finally gives. The slab that released broke across a width the camera captured in full and began moving downhill immediately. Cole turned. The footage shows him attempting to run across the fall line, an instinctive response that avalanche training specifically addresses, because it rarely works on a slope already in motion. The snow beneath his feet destabilized as the slab accelerated. He went down before the main mass reached him, falling forward onto the moving surface. Within seconds, the slide overtook his position. A brief movement of one arm was visible above the surface before the snow closed over him completely. When the slide stopped, the surface was smooth and unbroken. There was no indication from above of where he was beneath it. The camera remained partially upright, its lower half buried by the outer edge of the deposit. It continued recording. The audio captured faint ambient movement and the occasional settling sound of the snowpack. Nothing else. The recording ran until the battery gave out, preserving the full sequence from the first fracture to the final stillness of the debris field. He had told no one where he was going. There was no filed trip plan, no check-in contact, no one expecting him at a specific time. The camera's footage was the only reason searchers eventually located the area. A person familiar with his content flagged the last known upload location based on visible terrain features in his previous videos, and that information was passed to a local search and rescue organization. The recovery operation required probing and excavation across the debris field. Cole was located beneath several feet of compacted snow. The official findings confirmed death by avalanche burial, with asphyxiation as the cause. The snow conditions were later assessed by a field specialist, who noted that the weak layer responsible for the release had been identifiable in regional snowpack reports issued before the date of the incident. The report also noted the absence of any safety equipment as a contributing factor in the outcome. The recovered camera, the tripod, and the footage were turned over as part of the case documentation. No other equipment was found at the scene. The case was closed with the cause and manner of death formally recorded.